Hey everybody, it's me, and I look like this because I've been sick for a few days, and this is about as dressed up as I can get right now. It's either grade or dress. Sorry, I've got my notes here and they don't want to stand up. I'm going to try to go through weeks 8, 9, 10, 11 was break, and then book group. And I'll do it as quickly as I can so that you don't have to listen for too long. And also, as always, I've left you guys lots of personal comments in the grade book about what you actually wrote. All right, so if you recall all the way back to week 8, that was the street level bureaucracy week, and we had a lot of very interesting conversation about how much discretion the actual employees, who are probably at the bottom of their totem pole, which is kind of interesting to look back on now that you've talked about rankism and who gets rank pulled on them. And a lot of you made the point that when you enter a job at the bottom of a totem pole, that's almost like a setup to be at the receiving end of that rankism. So maybe looking back a little bit at the street level bureaucrat, they're at the bottom of their totem pole, and perhaps when they pull rank on some of the people that they're dealing with, or when they take discretion too liberally to the detriment of the people they're working with, it may be some of that feeling like that's what's done to them by their higher ups. Anyway, returning to the actual conversation, I think one of the most interesting comments that was made early on in the writings was about organizational culture and how that impacts the way that street level bureaucrats act. And Jeffrey actually mentioned that he had seen excellent health care in his own family. He particularly noted that caregivers were able to empathize and adjust to what the family needed, and that was really important and had been helpful. But then when he looked at some of the abuses that we discussed, he felt like it was necessary to actually dial back that discretion. And I'm wondering whether I think that's true. I am wondering whether the positive benefits that Jeffrey saw in his own family from some folks taking discretion should be dialed back because of a few bad apples. And then Angela told about being a bureaucrat from the other side of the table. And if you will recall, her experience was just how pressured and how overworked, and how people who came in with really good intentions ended up doing things that they might have regretted later. And so when I was thinking about that and getting back to whosever comment it was about ethical organizational culture, and please forgive me for not remembering who said it, but I thought that may be the key. I think that it may be that if the office itself and the people who are the leadership in the office insist on an ethical culture, train people in an ethical culture, do a really good job of hiring and screening and background checking and checking all references, and only letting people in who have exhibited ethics and in their past jobs, and then making it clear over and over again, and providing some kind of release for people who are stressed in their job and so forth, that might go a long way towards setting expectations of behavior. I think when everybody feels like there's nothing they can do about it, kind of the way Angela expressed in her situation, then you're going to have people just letting go of their standards, and I think that happens sometimes. So I have one more comment on week 8, and that was that if you did not take Marissa's link to the Soup Kitchen website, I strongly urge you to do so. It actually opens into an area that asks you to imagine yourself walking through the doors to a soup kitchen, not as a volunteer, but as somebody who was hungry and needed to eat, and helps you think about how this feels from the other side. I thought it was a thoughtful piece and a really excellent tool, and I will probably be incorporating it in maybe not this class, but my Inclusive Communities class next semester. So Marissa, thank you for that. Okay, so now week 9. That was the week, if you'll recall, that we were looking at ethical codes. I would just like to point out that some of the codes that you found were very long and very detailed, and some were rather short. Some of you really liked the definitiveness of the codes, while some of you saw the codes as limiting. I want to share my own opinion of codes, and these are generic statements, and just remember that that each code is a little bit different, so I'm talking generically. First of all, codes are developed by a group of people who sit down, in a committee meeting, or maybe an individual who starts it and then passes it around after that person has fleshed it out. But they're started by people who basically are working with ideas about things that have happened bad in the past. Excuse me, as I said, I've been sick, so I have no voice. I hope this isn't that painful for you to listen to. Anyway, the people who are writing codes for any given organization basically know what problems have come up either in their own organization, which is sometimes what triggers writing these codes, or in other organizations in their sector or industry. And so they are really trying to write a code against things that they know might come up. And maybe they even sit there and think about what else hasn't come up, but we can envision it coming up. But usually codes are about trying to prevent things that have happened in the past. Excuse me. So yes, if a code has a provision that addresses a particular issue that comes up, it's much easier to apply a code. But the problem with codes is they don't anticipate everything that could come up. And as times change and technology changes and even business models and the way we structure organizations, we used to be very hierarchical. Now we're flattening out, as Thomas Friedman says. We can't anticipate everything. The great thing about having the ability to do your own analysis and to be able to recognize whether this is a teleological argument and we need to supplement it with a deontological and virtue frames, or one of the others, is that if something isn't covered by all of the little standards in your code, you can still work your way through it. Yes, sometimes your answers aren't as clear when you do it that way. Sometimes, or mostly, you see the benefits and detriments when you do your own analysis from every perspective. The key isn't that there is a right answer. The key is that you are able to make sure you haven't missed anything by going through all of those analysis lenses. And then if you have to weigh and balance out, the good against the bad, you basically do that by deciding, you've got your little list. Deontologically, this would be good because, and it would be bad because. Teleologically, this, and this, same. And then you look and you say, well, which of these do I prioritize more highly and why? And you basically prioritize all the goods and the bads and you make your mind up. But the benefit to that is no matter who asks you, why didn't you think of that? Or how come you didn't go that way? You've thought about it. You know exactly why you made the choice that you made. There are many times when there is not going to be one right answer. And the most important thing is for you to be able to explain how you got to the answer you came to. That is going to uphold your own reputation, speaking of virtue ethics. All right, so I also, during the week 9, I really liked Sam's comments that a code without explanations for why those standards are in there basically results in people following rules without understanding why they're following them, which is really not a very good idea. And it's interesting because that puts people in a position of having to memorize a bunch of standards without being taught to think for themselves. And it's my personal opinion that is rarely good. Sometimes things need to be handled very, very consistently, and in that case, I understand it. But as a general rule, life is very fuzzy. Okay, so then one of your scenarios, a city manager was asked to meet with an editorial board to give background information about an upcoming election. I don't know if you guys all remember that scenario, but I just want to point out that actually it is very ethical for a city manager to meet with an editorial board. In fact, it's an ethical duty, and I don't remember who had that scenario, but whoever it was felt that the city manager should not go talk to the editorial board. And I just want to clear this up. It's absolutely a city manager's job to inform the public about what's going on at the city. To the extent that there is something that's not ready to be public yet, okay, you don't have to talk about that. But we want our city government to be transparent, and that means that our city officials are willing to share out information. In this case, the editorial board just asked for background information, and there's nothing wrong and everything right about using a local news venue to get that background information about the election, when it's going to be held, where it's going to be held, how many people they're expecting, how many polling places, how do they decide on where to hold the polling places and how many to set up, what are the hours. You can think about all of that as really important information to get out. All right, so I think we're going to move on to week 10. Yes, I'm big on these graphics. I think they're more interesting to look at than me in my kitchen. All right, I just have one thing to talk to you about. If you will recall, week 10 was the week that we went on to GuideStar, and I introduced you to the 990 if you weren't already familiar with it. So I want to remind you that all the information in a 990 is actually curated by the organization before it gets there. If you think about them deciding which pieces of what we do are we going to share, because even if there is a blank that calls for something, they could, they have to decide how are they going to explain it. Organizations are on their honor to tell the truth there and not to make stuff up. And the reality is that unless somebody catches an organization in some kind of a lie or misleading statement, the IRS is not going to chase all of those nonprofits down just to fact check. If you think about it, we've got like 3 or 4 news fact checking organizations that chase down what politicians say, but we don't have the tax dollars to have the IRS chase down all of the hundreds of thousands of nonprofit organizations and government agencies that don't have to, and who would do them? But anyway, we don't have anybody to chase down all those facts. So I just want to remind you that even though 990 is a great source of information, sometimes if things don't feel right or seem right, you might want to see if you can find another way to look into them, because again, they're curated. Last topic, and I think I'm doing this pretty well actually, trying to plow through these weeks, is book group. And I want to tell you that I really enjoyed reading your personal stories of being somebodies and nobodies. And I also appreciated the fact that it put certain experiences that you've had in a new light for some of you. And I hope that that's useful moving forward. So I just want to make a few comments on some of the stories that you told. Matthew was telling a story that he started by saying that he knows that rankism does, in fact, happen to everyone, regardless of color, religion, sex, gender, etc. And I think the point that Matthew was making is that you don't have to be one of the minority or non-dominant social groups to have rank pulled on you, and I think that that's very true. And all of your stories about having rank pulled on you in your early jobs is a pretty good description proving that. But I do want to comment that his comment made me think about the whole concept of intersectionality. And we haven't really talked about intersectionality in this class. But for those of you who don't know, intersectionality is what happens when you belong to more than one non-dominant group. So the easy example to give for explanation point is if you happen to be African American and you happen to be female, you are probably going to, you will at some point in your life suffer from the oppression that comes from being African American and simultaneously the oppression that comes from being female. One of the examples that's given of that is like factory jobs. So there are some jobs in factories that are just for men, and those are usually floor jobs, down there working with the equipment and stuff. And there are sometimes factory jobs that are just for women, and this is more in the past than now, but it's still a good example. Now we tend to let women down on the floor, but for many, many years, women in factories really worked at, secretarial jobs, administrative, clerical jobs. The problem is, if you were a white man, you could get a management job or a floor job. If you were a black man, the racism came in that typically black men were put on the factory floor, very rarely allowed into management. If you were a white woman, you could get a clerical job. If you were a black woman, all those clerical jobs were given to white women. So black men were discriminated against one way. They weren't allowed into management. But black women were discriminated against two ways, or three really. They weren't allowed into management. They weren't allowed on the floor because those were men's jobs. And they weren't allowed into the secretarial pool because those were white women's jobs. So you see that women got it, black women got it coming and going. White women were discriminated against because they weren't allowed into management, and if they wanted to be, they weren't allowed into the floor, which actually they might have wanted to be because those generally paid more. So anyway, sorry, my point about all of this, and I'm going to leave you a little video about intersectionality in case I'm confusing you or this is your first exposure. But my point about all of this is that when you add rankism to other isms that may already exist for someone, when you are the new person on the block in a job, but you also happen to be a woman, or you also happen to be a person of color, or you also happen to be disabled, or maybe you're more than one of those, plus you're the new person on the job, you're going to experience more one down position than just the person who is a dominant group in the new person's job. And so we do have to be aware of the way that rankism intersects with these other identity groups that sometimes find themselves being oppressed. Okay, Jeffrey's story. Jeffrey told this story that he has a best friend who happens to be his wife's cousin, and they're all married, two couples married, have kids around the same ages, hang out a lot, right? And he was saying how Tyler is like sort of overly assertive. He makes a lot of decisions. He tries to control stuff. And what that amounted to for the purpose of his story was that the wives didn't really care where they were going to dinner, but Tyler did care where they were going to dinner, and he made an announcement, and that was supposed to be the end of it. But in this case, Jeffrey happened to be driving, and so he had the wheels, and he basically decided they were not going to the restaurant that Tyler proposed. But he didn't talk to Tyler about it. They just got in the car, and when Tyler figured out that they weren't going where they thought they were going, basically Jeffrey said, "No, we're not going there. We're going here because I want to," in a tone of voice that he was later sorry about. So the situation ended up being, like a bad situation for the evening. Of course, they're related by marriage and friendship, and they got over it. But the point that I want to make about Jeffrey's story is that Jeffrey, as good of friends as he is with Tyler and how connected they are, he had not been able in all of this time to start a conversation with Tyler about how overbearing he was. And in actuality, every time Tyler did that, he was being rankist in a sense. Not necessarily because he had actual legitimate rank, but because he had, like some sense of self-entitlement to that rank. And Jeffrey said that if he had to do it again, he would have liked to had a discussion with him where he explained to him that, that he would like to sometimes have more say in stuff and not have Tyler be such a I don't know if you would call it a bully, but, just so self-centered about how these things were handled. This actually reminded me of another class that I taught this semester, or I'm still teaching. Students were discussing some questions of gender bias in small groups in a class that I teach called Inclusive Communities. And as I was going around the room and listening to student groups talk, one of the groups of women was discussing, it was just 3 women, how they make themselves small, sometimes actually physically small, and sometimes just like trying to minimize their presence, not physically, but in terms of, staying quiet, just to avoid conflict. One of the women, in fact, they all had stories, but one told this story of a man sitting next to her on an airplane, and he was just like kind of leaning into her seat space. He took over the armrest, etc. And in order to not, conflict with the space with him, she made herself smaller and moved herself over to the other side of her seat. And the more she moved herself over, the more the guy just spread out, as she called it, manspreading. I had never heard that term, but I like it. It goes with mansplaining. Manspreading into her seat. And she had 5 hours of having to share her seat with a man that just kept moving and moving into her space. And I asked her if she had been the one that was in somebody's space, maybe not even thinking about it, but just did it. If somebody had brought it to her attention, would she be mad about it? And she said, no, she wouldn't be mad about it. And so then I asked her why she hadn't said something to the man. Excuse me, I don't know, excuse me, you seem to be leaning over onto me, or, I don't know what. And she just basically said she did not want to make waves. She was willing to endure 5 really uncomfortable hours not to make waves. And I hear this all the time. In fact, there's research out there by a guy named Chris Argyris, who unfortunately passed away about 2 years ago. But he was the mentor of another faculty member who is no longer here, but she was my dissertation chair at UMKC when I was there, Joan Gallos, Dr. Gallos. And Dr. Argyris research suggests that people will create all kinds of problems, ruin things they're working on, whatever, to avoid conflict and to avoid making waves or to destroy relationships. Jeffrey's story brought this to mind for me because clearly Tyler was his very good friend, and yet he avoided the conversation, and instead he ended up handling it in a way that was kind of passive-aggressive, I guess. And Jeffrey, I don't mean to embarrass you. I just mean that it would be good for all of us to look at ourselves and to ask ourselves, why is it that we avoid just having a simple conversation, and in the end, when handle something in a way that we're ashamed of later? You get to the same point, you get to the same conversation if you just initiated the conversation rationally. And I'm not meaning you, Jeffrey. I'm meaning, all of us. We all do this. That's what Dr. Argyris' research demonstrated. We're going to get to that same point of conflict. Wouldn't it be nice if we did it intentionally and in a way that we could be proud of later instead of having to look back on these things? Anyway, for Jeffrey, it was clearly a learning experience, but I just want to bring that to mind. Okay, that's 24 minutes. I covered 4 weeks in 24 minutes. And it's toward the end of the semester. We're actually a week ahead of you at ASU, and so I am just grading like a fiend. It seems like I'm spending all day, every day that I'm not actually planning a class or teaching a class, grading. So just know that I read absolutely everything and that I do leave you lots of comments in the comment section in the grade book. And if you want to talk to me for any reason, or if you want to, if you have any questions about anything I left for you in the grade book, please don't hesitate to email me, and we can do a cyber meeting if you'd like. I try to, nobody shows up, but I'm available for you if you want it. Okay, I will see you soon on the boards. Bye-bye.